Everybody.
I
will
do the introduction, Chris. I got it.
Oh, you got it.
The
Okay.
introduction.
I felt a pregnant pause, so I figured I would join. Okay.
Boy, I think it's the first time somebody's ever tried to introduce a session instead of me. Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome to the next session of CME Palooza Spring. I am Scott Kober, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza, and I would like to welcome you to our next session, which is entitled Bridges Over Oceans, Making Global Meetings Available to Interested Learners Around the World. And this session is sponsored by both Helio CME and Vindico Medical Education. Our moderator for this session, as you already heard from, is Chris Kriz. Chris is the president of PVI. So before we begin, I would like to thank all of the sponsors of CME Palooza Spring, our gold sponsors, Daiichi Sankyo, Med Learning Group, and Physicians Education Resource. Our silver sponsors, the Academy for Continued Healthcare Learning, Academic CME, Antidote Education Company, Catamount Medical Education, Hippocrates, and Helio CME, as well as Integrity CME, Platform Q Health Education, Prova Education, RedMed Ed, and Vindico Medical Education. And then finally, our bronze sponsors, Answers in CME, Bonum Continuing Education, CMEology, CME Outfitters, Excalibur Medical Education, Global Education Group, Infograph Ed, Integritas Communications, MedIQ, Paradigm Medical Communications, Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, PriMed, PVI, RMEI Medical Education, and Wright Medicine. So there are 3 ways to ask questions during this and all of our CME Palooza sessions. You can use the Creative Educational Concepts text line to send in a question. The number is 267-6660-CME. That's 0263. You can tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. And for those of you who may be watching using the watching in YouTube, you can enter in questions using the YouTube chat function. We will be incorporating audience response questions during this presentation. And we'd like to thank Array for sponsoring the use of our audience response system. We use Poll Everywhere. So to access the audience response system, you can either go download the Poll Everywhere app and join the presentation entitled CME Palooza 005, or type in the URL being shown there on your screen in a web browser. We've got a bunch of questions throughout this session. And with that, I am going to turn this over to Chris to begin the session and to introduce our panel.
Thank you so much, Scott. Welcome, everyone. And I would like to just begin by recognizing the esteemed panel that I'm humbled to be joined by today, representing a broad group of perspectives. And so starting with Maria Deutsch. Maria heads up grant making for the oncology arena and at Bristol Myers Squibb. Thank you, Maria, for joining us today. Katie Doyle is representing the IME office at Gilead. And Katie actually sort of began this journey with us a couple of months ago at the Alliance annual meeting, where we put together a poster on this topic. And then it sort of gave rise to expanding the idea to involve some more input. And so thank you for joining us, Katie, and for being involved through this journey. Mark Morgan, also joining from BMS. Mark is actually on the cardiovascular side, however, and therefore is bringing a different perspective. Thank you for joining us, Mark. And Jackie Waldrop. Jackie heads up oncology grant making for the Global Medical Grants Group at Pfizer, and brings not only his supporter perspective, but also a valuable society perspective from her former life. And so we're grateful to have Jackie join us today as well. Thank you, Jackie. Just from the housekeeping standpoint, we just wanted to make clear that what we say today and our opinions and perspectives are our own and not of our employers or our previous employers or anyone other than just ourselves. So that's who you're going to be hearing from. And, you know, we've learned so much. I've learned so much myself from my peers on this panel. And, it's also caused me to become a bit more self-directed learner and seeking out more information. And we also feel that a session like this offers us the opportunity to learn from our viewers today. And so we do encourage you to do as Scott said, which is submit questions or thoughts or your own experiences. And we really want to learn from you as much as from each other. So thank you for doing that. So we're going to start beginning on learning from you a little bit with some polling.
Okay, so here's our first question. So for those of you who have the Poll Everywhere app or have that URL up, so what is your organization's level of interest in supporting or providing independent accredited symposia at congresses outside the US? So you'll see this OUS acronym here in a bunch of the questions. So your choices are, my organization is active in supporting or executing IME Symposia OUS. My organization is interested but not yet active in supporting or executing IME Symposia OUS. Or my organization is not interested in this topic, but I want to learn more. So a little bit all over the board here. So I'll give people another couple seconds to chime in. I should have frozen it when it was 33% for everybody. But yeah, it looks pretty close. So kind of a mixed bag of experiences and interests here. Okay. So we'll move on to the next question. How experienced are you personally with supporting or executing symposia for OUS congresses? Not at all experienced, somewhat experienced, or experienced. I guess I should have been playing a little bit of Jimi Hendrix behind this, the Are You Experienced album.
That's definitely a Derek comment.
That is a Derek comment. Yeah, he's always got the music queued up. I'm a little bit behind on that one. All right, so it looks like the majority of people don't have a lot of experience or have some minimal experience. Okay, so there's one last question as we start things out here. This kind of gets into everyone's specific role in their organization. Which aspects of independent medical education are you primarily focused on in your current role? Compliance and grant funding on the supporter side, grant request development on the provider side, program logistics on the provider side, content development, outcomes, accreditation compliance, or the catch-all other, which never seems to get any responses. All right, so lots of supporters here, which is great. And lots of people in compliance. Oh, and somebody had to vote for the other just because I mentioned that no one ever votes for other. So again, people kind of from a variety of backgrounds, which is always nice to see. It's good for for this education. So, okay, so Chris, I'm going to move on to the next slide and you can go ahead.
Thank you, Scott. So what we hope to leave learners with today is the ability to articulate the benefits as well as some of the challenges and barriers of supporting IME or accredited education in the context of symposia that are on the ground outside of the United States. We'd like to help people to be able to explain the value of doing this to stakeholders that they may internally or externally engage with. And then hopefully we leave you with some practical ideas around how to facilitate obtaining support for, supporting, and implementing these types of activities for the benefit of global learners. So from the standpoint of how we will move through the agenda today, Scott, you can move on to the agenda slide. We'll start with benefits and the value proposition. We'll then move on to challenges and barriers. We'll then get into practical considerations for developing and reviewing educational grant requests for these types of activities, and then hopefully leave you with a few things to reflect on as we conclude. So I think Scott's going to poll you one more time here.
Okay, so this is our word cloud. So this takes a little more thought. So I'll give people a little more time to respond for this one. So in 1 or 2 words, what are some of the reasons why independent or accredited education might be valuable OUS? So again, outside the United States. So here are some of the responses that are coming up. Collaboration, credibility, credit, competence, diversity. So it's interesting to see kind of how these things build as you're kind of getting some responses. And I don't know how much people are actually using word clouds during their education. I've seen it used in various ways. But I think this is one of the first times that we're actually using it. But just from that perspective, it's interesting to see how it builds. So it's certainly collaboration, credit, access, all coming in high on the list.
Interesting. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Well, we're going to start off, as I said, with exploring some of the benefits potentially of supporting IME or accredited education. And we're trying to maintain a scope of really within the framework of symposia that take place at global congresses that are held outside of the United States. So in that regard, just to sort of set the scene, I'm going to ask Jackie to help us with this a little bit. So I think many of us in the IME industry here in the United States are very familiar with the concept of satellite symposia. And we go to congresses here in the United States and we see those programs, and those programs by and large are accredited CME activities. However, when you go abroad and you travel to, say, a meeting in Europe, it looks a little different. There's still symposia, but they look different. And I've heard, terms called industry-led or company-led to describe what those are. But Jackie, could you maybe just, for those of us that maybe aren't as familiar with what the non-IME, non-accredited version of those is and what it looks like in Europe, maybe describe that a little bit for us?
Yep, sure. Thanks, Chris. So this was really a good place for us to start. And as we started planning this session, we initially were talking about accredited education. And so we definitely wanted to step back and think about this more than just the terms of credit. From an industry supporter perspective, there are, in essence, only two buckets of things, which are independent education and then company-led or company-influenced education. And that's certainly true, actually, worldwide, definitely in the US. In Europe, it's a little bit more complicated under these FPA code of conduct. And they really talk about education in three categories, and they give us the third category of collaborative education. So it was interesting to me in the word cloud. I mean, a lot of people were putting in the word credit, which I think is front of mind in this topic. But collaboration was interesting to me that came up as one of the really big points that people were typing in. So, so I think that's just a really good place for us to start. And so for today, I know we're going to be really focused on the independent education space and the benefits of doing that outside the US. The other thing that's interesting about it is in Europe, independent education and company-led education can both be certified for credit. So even if our companies are involved in actually overseeing or reviewing the content, it's still possible to get CME or CE credits, get the activity certified for credit in Europe. So anyway, just to put that out there as a place for us to start the conversation.
No, that's very interesting, and Jackie, because I've noticed that I've never seen actually a company-led activity that had credit associated with it, but with dealing with some of the European accreditors and some of the questions that they would ask, I got the feeling that they have dealt with that before, and they have actually provided credit for company-led programs. And you're sort of from an American perspective or an ACCME's perspective, you're listening to the questions that they're asking, and they're preposterous from our standpoint, but from their standpoint, maybe not so much. So that's really interesting that you brought that up. So I think, one of the things that I've noticed, and certainly you guys can weigh in, and I've attended some of the company-led programs just out of curiosity, like what is the difference between these? And they definitely feel different. There's much more of a feeling that the supporter's presence is very much there. It might be their color scheme. It might be more of their employees that are around, and even things like logos and things that you would never see in an accredited or an IME activity. So I've noticed, some differences and also maybe some differences in other ways as well, which we'll touch on. So, I wanted to sort of throw this to Mark. I mean, I think from supporter's perspective, there may be reasons why they would value doing a company-led program versus an IME or an independent program. But from the standpoint of a learner, do you think that the learners perceive those two types of programs differently? And I think, in the United States, I think that, let's say, an industry product theater in the exhibit hall, I think learners in the United States are familiar with kind of why that's different than an accredited symposium that they might attend. But, in, let's say, in Europe, or a company-led activity, maybe even one that somehow has managed to get credit from some organization, certainly not ACCME, but somebody else. Do you believe that in the global arena that learners are beginning to be able to tell the difference between these types of programs?
Yeah, well, first, thanks, Chris, for the question. So I honestly, I think that obviously within the U.S. Arena, learners are really able to differentiate between the two. But previously, historically, in the ex-U.S. Arena, I felt like learners really looked at them both as education and really good education, and they are both still really good education. And I just think that learners are really enjoying that free-flowing scientific exchange that can occur in IME, that back and forth with the faculty. That kind of free-flowing scientific exchange doesn't really occur in a company sponsored, and people are really looking for that. They really are looking to see what can they do in a situation where the guidelines are really not there. What can they do when the baseline data is kind of not really present? Let me hear from the faculty themselves what they really want to do, and I feel like that's something that IME obviously does really well, and that learners are really attracted to.
That's interesting, Mark. And I've had the same sense, and I haven't, it's funny that when we polled everybody, nobody labeled themselves as very experienced. Everyone was sort of no experience or somewhat. And I think, I would label myself as somewhat. I mean, I don't think any of us are really claiming to be experts in this area, which is why we're trying to learn more. So part of my learning journey is I try to attend some of these company-led events. And one of the things that I've noticed is there seems to be, you just get the feeling there's kind of a ring fence around what's being discussed in some way. It's not, as you were saying, free exchange, that there are some boundaries. And so I think it's interesting that you're pointing out that, are learners perceiving those boundaries, and is that frustrating to them in some way, that their world isn't that neat when they go back and they practice in the clinic, and they need to, have that free ability to speak openly. And so, Katie, from the standpoint of, learners maybe perceiving these things differently, what about faculty? When a faculty member is invited to participate in a company-led activity versus an accredited activity, do you think that the faculty member perceives those two opportunities differently? Do they value one over the other? Will they be more likely to say yes to one than the other? And does that matter in terms of the caliber of faculty that might participate? And what does that mean for learners and the value that they place? It's sort of tying the learner and the faculty back together again.
Hi, Chris. Thank you. I'm excited about being here and how this initial poster led to this. And if I had to take the poll, I am not experienced hardly at all in this. And that's what led to all of it, because we were interested in supporting IME OUS. And so this is my first time working with peer review in order to make that happen. So I want to be transparent that I'm learning during this as well. So having in the past, in previous roles, organized company-led, I do know that faculty do perceive it differently because of the way the funds come directly from the industry supporter, right? So you're getting paid by the industry supporter. It's not, you don't get paid by the provider. And sometimes those transfers of value can be some faculty are resistant, right, to kind of reporting those transfers of value. And I also know that, as Mark was saying, that peer-to-peer discussion in company-led is sometimes missing because it's very, as you said, there's a ring around it. Everything has to go through MRC. It's limited topic-wise to disease state, and for the most part on label, even though it's not a product theater. And also faculty with the industry supporter has to go through a training, right? So there, and compliance is often in the room. So it feels a lot more limited as to what they can speak about. And so I mentioned this on the pre-call, is I think the attendance, particularly in the US, I'm not so sure about OUS, the attendance it tends to be full of the industry supporters and the competition, and not so much the learners that we'd be seeking from an independent standpoint.
Interesting. Thank you. I think the faculty perspective is one that sometimes, you could easily overlook in terms of, what's their preference. So I thought it was great that you brought that up. So, Jackie had sort of at the top of this raised the issue of independent medical education. It may be accredited, it may not be accredited. And really, the hope with it is that it doesn't matter. Either way, it should be independent. The key word is independence. So the supporter is not exerting influence. However, I think everyone sort of has, every supporter, there is slightly different in terms of maybe some of the internal preferences around accredited versus non-accredited. That might come from compliance folks and things who take different interpretations. So, put Maria a little bit on the spot with this. I mean, and you don't need to be specific to any individual supporter, but do you think that sometimes is an issue, that a supporter might prefer an accredited framework versus non-accredited IME?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And it is something that we take seriously at BMS. Accreditation speaks to compliance. And when you have that extra bit of accreditation, meaning a seal of approval, so to speak, you get you get more value. So we know that it's fair balanced, scientifically rigorous, medically accurate. We like to pride ourselves in the United States, at least, by having that seal of approval. So when you get outside of US, not many of the countries are in line with that. And an accredited IME, I feel, holds more value than an unaccredited IME. And sometimes there's a compliance issue within your company that they only allow accreditation of ex-US or even within the United States type of activities that they would prefer we support.
Yeah, I think we'd heard that, from other supporters that we talked to as well. And as I said, every supporter is going to have different, rules and interpretations, but there was a sense that if they looked at the content scope of an activity and it happened to be in an area where things were changing rapidly, indications were expanding, new therapies were emerging. So it was an area that maybe the supporter might say, this is an area that we might even require this have accreditation if we're going to support it with grant-funded education. So anyway, thank you for kind of raising sort of maybe some of the considerations of going accredited versus non-accredited IME. I wanted to just touch on something else related to company-led versus independent or grant-supported education. And this has to do with the outcomes data that come out of it. And I think these are valuable in, measuring the impact of the education. Was it successful in addressing root causes and closing gaps? Was it, revealing of anything in terms of ongoing educational need? And there's a lot of wealth of outcomes data that we're used to in the accredited world. Is that something that you think exists so much on the company-led side? Or, does IME have an advantage there? And is that something that maybe could be an additional level of value? Jackie, can you maybe speak to that at all?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. I think there's definitely a difference between the quality of the outcomes between IME and company-led education. From what I personally have only worked on the grant side, so I'm obviously probably biased towards it. But what I see on the company-led side is, they talk about outcomes in terms of KPIs, right? Key performance indicators, which in our CME world are about reach. So how many people attended, how many people clicked on the activity, and then perhaps if it's a video, how many minutes, on average do people spend in the video. But it's definitely, on the company-led side, they're focusing on what we would say is level 1 outcomes, right? And on the independent grant side, we are always, I think, going to level 3 and 4 in terms of actually proving that our learners knew more at the end of the activity than they did before, our intent to change, the competency questions, are case-based. So yeah, I think it's night and day in terms of the outcomes levels between IME and company-led.
Okay,
I'd
thanks.
like to
no,
add
sorry.
to that. Outcomes are our bread and butter, so to speak. We are able to show the increase in knowledge, confidence, but we are also able to use those outcomes to shape our medical strategy moving forward. And when we go into the outcomes from an ex-US activity, we're able to show, because that's usually the first line of education if a new drug is going to be introduced to the landscape. And it'll take those outcomes, what we grab from those outcomes will help us move forward in how we're going to educate moving in that landscape. And then once that's established and we're able to share worldwide outcomes, we can bring it into the United States and use it to build that way as well. Mark, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that? Because I know that you've been doing a lot of global.
Yeah, no, and thank you, Maria. I really have seen this amazing breakdown of where some providers are able to give us, some MECs are able to give us detailed understanding of where the learner is pre and post for every question. So, maybe the educational landscape can be then viewed from a country to country specific, question by question in a response. So they'll be able to understand that learners in Europe had a lower understanding of diagnosis at baseline, and then were able to grow significantly, while learners at baseline in the United States had a higher level. So when you're looking at those outcomes, we're really looking and seeing, well, where are the learners pre, where are the learners post, and where are the additional gaps available in order to fill those gaps and to improve education overall.
Thanks, Mark. I think you'd made sorry, Scott, did you have a question?
Yeah. So if I can jump in, there's a question that came in over the Creative Educational Concepts text line, and it kind of speaks to a little bit about what you were just talking about, Mark, is how much are you seeing outcomes broken out geographically from your ex-US events, and how much value is there in that breakdown from a supporter standpoint?
I think I could take this question. I mean, honestly, this is very foundational and very important, and we're seeing it a lot. Honestly, this really is looked at from a country by country basis. Every country is looking at where are their learners, and where can their learners grow. Where are their learners at baseline, and where their learners can grow ultimately. And so we're actually seeing this more and more, and we're requesting it from providers if they're able to do it. It's something that we're looking at. Seeing, can you provide us with this data if it's possible?
Cool. Thank you, Mark. And you'd made another point when we spoke earlier where the outcome story doesn't end with the live symposium. And I think that's one of the things with some of the company-led programs where it may end there. There might not be an enduring activity that goes more broadly, and then the rich outcomes that can come from that as well. And so, that sort of thought of, is there an economic benefit potentially or a greater efficiency in developing education in an accredited or an independent framework where therefore you can get a broader reach with the education and then the data that come with that? Would you agree?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if you think of a Congress, right, and you think of the room of when a symposium can occur, ultimately, there is a cap, right? Like, think about it. At most, you're going to get about 200 learners. What about the 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 learners that an enduring initiative can do? Honestly, there's been such great reach from an enduring IME, and how much value that brings, especially for things that are broad spectrum. For like example, foundational education, foundational diagnosis, foundational treatment landscape, foundational prevalence of the disease. How important that is to bring that education to the masses is ex-US and US. It's fantastic, and it's very important.
Great. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. So why don't we move on to challenges and barriers? So we've articulated, I think, why IME can be a very attractive way to do these programs versus company-led. And we're not saying that one way is right and the other way is wrong. I think there's room in the world for both, and they each have a role to play. And there are some unique benefits of each. So challenges and things to overcome. And we'll kind of start off with Jackie again, because Jackie's raised an interesting point that really stems from a challenge that we face with societies. And Jackie, coming from a society background originally, I think is particularly attuned to it. And why don't you go ahead and describe that challenge for us, Jackie?
Great, thank you. So yes, for us, this is a really hot topic. So, the question specifically is talking about the issue of satellite symposia alongside congresses outside of the US. So, and you're right, I did, before I went to Pfizer a long time ago, work for the American Heart Association. So I do have some of the society perspective as well. Also to bring in, what evolved in the US that we have not seen yet evolve outside of the US. So the crux of the topic comes down to how satellite symposia slots are assigned alongside major congresses. And what we're seeing across Europe is that the major congresses, certainly in oncology, but I think it's more than just oncology, are allocating slots only to industry sponsors. So sort of symposia packages go along with your exhibit booth and your advertising package. And depending on how big your booth is, it's how many slots you get, right? So there's all these things around the actual Congress itself. And so where we've been struggling is we would really like to be able to support grants for CME providers to do independent satellite symposia at these congresses. And the barrier that we've run into is how to actually get that slot to the CME provider, because the congresses have it so closely linked to the sponsorship packages. What we're facing is, can a commercial supporter give the slot to the CME provider? And I think people are sort of handling this in different ways and have different approaches to it. But, currently, at least at Pfizer, we are sort of stuck on the ACCME standards for commercial support, which we do apply globally. So I think some people might say, well, why, ACCME doesn't apply outside the US, so why are you limiting yourself? But we follow ACCME standards just to ensure that our independent activities truly are independent worldwide. So it is kind of applying a higher standard. But the ACCME standards, if anyone wants to look it up, it's standard 4.1a. And it says that, as an industry supporter, you can't give anything of value towards the actual execution of a independent education activity. So yeah, I know it's a great topic. It's really timely for me to be part of this panel, and it's been interesting to hear other perspectives as we've started to discuss this together.
Thanks, Jackie. Yeah, I think there are some real challenges that we face with societies globally, really understanding what we have learned 18 years ago in the United States, which is the need to maintain separation between sales and marketing functions and education. And that's something that we are all very aware of now. I mean, there are some, examples of things that still in the United States I wish didn't exist, like, holding, a slot only for people who are exhibitors. And that still is something that we see here in the United States, amazingly, among societies. So we shouldn't be really too critical of the societies overseas, because, they have a long way to go. They're ways behind us. But I think it's really incumbent upon all of us to try to educate them, to try to explain the why, and why this is important to us. And so, Katie, just sort of flipping over to you for a second, I think that as we enter this era, we're in a gray zone in a lot of ways. We like here in the United States, where things are much more black and white. Everybody knows what the rules are, societies, providers, supporters, and it's very clear. As soon as we go overseas, it's a little murkier. So, we've then faced the tension of, well, we still need to operate in that gray area. We still need to get things done. We need to accomplish things. And so, do you find that you find yourself, in the position of just trying to educate your internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders to try to move this process forward and get everyone to evolve to where we want them to be?
Yes, and I do think that a lot of it is dependent on the risk tolerance of your business conduct colleagues, because compliance is ultimately the one that makes the decision as to whether or not something like this is what the company would like to pursue. And I think before even trying to pursue it, the first thing is to decide whether it's aligned with your medical strategy, right? And so I had to work with the TA team to find out if they even wanted to have the symposium that Peerview is now working on with us at this particular meeting. I actually thought it was going to be a different meeting, but they decided that they wanted to do a company led there. And I think the organization's first thought is the company led gives them more access to work on the content and all of that, whereas independent is thought of as, well, we don't have any control over it, which, like a typical grants manager, I think that's a good thing, right? And I also don't want to miss out on any opportunity to educate. So if there's a sponsorship package that includes that and your business conduct allows for it to be handed over, I think it's different. There's a little bit of nuance, again, the gray area of one of my colleagues works on the HIV side, and at certain meetings, the company has to purchase the slot, right? And it's not part of a package. It's not like that all in where, oh, and you get a symposium slot. It's like and BC was like, no, we're not going to actually purchase the slot, the individual slot, and pick the time and do all that and be that involved. But if it's part of a whole package where we just get all of these things and it would go unused, that's where I had to make the had to advocate for using that to get the education out there, and the independent piece of it was made clear to the society, because first you have to make sure, will the society allow this? That's step one. Or are they going to say no, it's part of your package and you can't give it to someone else? So if they say no, it's a no-go. And then if they say yes, then you have to make clear that that you as an industry supporter, like me as a grants manager, like I'm out, like, so there was an email exchange where I was like, okay, conference organizers, you're not going to talk to me about this anymore. You're going to talk straight to Peerview. So we maintain the independence. And so having all that documented with the grant, and I think we're going to talk about what's important to look at in the grant review process for these types of symposia, but to acknowledge that, have it in addition to the LOA that says that we're hands off, that there's this piece of the symposium is part of the sponsorship, but we're not handling it. That was what business conduct instructed me to do in order to make this happen. So
Cool.
hoops to jump through, but worth it if you there's education you want done and it complies with what your business conduct allows.
Yeah, and just to interject, the provider side of that as well. I mean, I think we're all sort of on the same team in terms of trying to educate societies around the difference between independent education and company-led education. So supporters are trying to do that and explain why they're different and why they need to be kept apart. And then, once we're developing the activities, we see other things that manifest in kind of lumping them all together. The society might, for instance, list all of their company-led activities on a page, and then in there somewhere, slotted in alphabetically, is the IME or the accredited activity, and they're not really distinguishing between the two. And in fact, sometimes they're using inappropriate language, saying this is the Pfizer program, when it's not. It's supported by an independent grant from Pfizer, but it is not the Pfizer program, and please take that logo down. And I think those are things that, a lot of us have seen, and that, as providers, we try to be proactive with monitoring those listings as they come up, communicating very quickly. What we found is that societies have been very accommodating and understanding once it's explained to them what the issue is. They're not doing it maliciously. They're doing it because they don't know any differently. And so I think that's just really what we've all found, is just have those conversations, and either directly as the supporter or ask the provider, say, hey, I noticed this. Would you maybe look into it, because we're not comfortable with how that looks.
Yeah, and I'm counting on you to do that for the one that we're working on.
Exactly. I wanted to ask, just from a practical standpoint, when you guys are reviewing these grants, so let's say you're reviewing a grant for an activity, and we're all U.S. kind of on the soil here in the United States, so U.S. grant offices, some of which have more global responsibility than others. But nonetheless, you get grants that might be for a program that's overseas and it's on the ground in another country, or it's submitted by a provider that is located overseas in another country. does that require additional levels of review for you? Meaning more stakeholders, more people need to sign off, possibly longer timelines, things that need to be thought of from a logistical standpoint when you're looking to review and support education of this kind. I don't know. Let me throw it to Maria because I haven't heard from you in a while. Can you speak to that?
I'm loving the conversation. I'm actually sitting back and enjoying everything that I'm hearing. So that depends, Chris. That's a loaded question. If the budget is coming from the United States, then we are the ones to decide if there should be a broader reach or not. Budgets are limited, and to make the most economical use of our budgets, we've collaborated with some of our external colleagues from different countries, asking if the grant aligns with their strategy, and if so, would they be interested in us supporting it, and then maybe them supporting the extra little bit that might take to broaden the reach to their areas of the country. So we've been very successful with that, especially with our Canadian colleagues. And it makes sense because it decreases any kind of redundancy or duplication of activities that need to be supported. And then it also broadens the reach because that's what we're all trying to get. I know I hate talking about numbers, but if you can work with a medical education company that has that ability to broaden the reach and get accreditation where it's needed, it would really benefit the learners and the healthcare professionals that are going to be attending.
And I can answer that also. Just to add a quick thought to Chris's question. So just a practical note also, when we do get a grant request from outside of the US, from an organization based ex-US, we do have to follow an extra review for FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And so basically it's our government making sure that when we're giving a grant to an organization outside of the US, that it's not for any bribery purpose, that it really is going for a legitimate education purpose. But I wanted to throw that out there because I know my last comment was about Symposia, but we are actually funding quite a lot of grants ex-US. So we're doing all types of educational activities around the world, quality improvement projects around the world. So we are actually a global program with increasing every year the amount of grants we're giving ex-US. It's just the Symposia slots that we're hung up on.
Hey, Chris, I've got a question that sort of fits in a little bit what Jackie was saying that came over the Creative Educational Concepts text line. Now, I know, Jackie, your processes, FIs are a little bit different than everyone else, but maybe the others can speak to this. Are you typically getting grant submissions, unsolicited grant submissions for ex-US meetings, or do these typically all come in as part of a closed RFP process?
I could speak. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, no, I could say that to a certain extent we are getting unsolicited grant requests for students outside of the U.S. As I think that a lot of providers are now looking and saying, "Hey, where can a logical educational program fit?" And then they're going and submitting programs and proposals proactively. And I think that makes total sense. And that also helps, us realize that, they have, they're thinking about the space. They're really looking at and evaluating where the learners are and where the learners need to be and how to actually target the correct learners. And I think that's something that we value.
I think that's a good segue into kind of where we want to go next, which is really looking at the practicalities of developing these grant requests, whether they're RFP driven or unsolicited. That's really where all of it starts. And so, Scott, I think we have a sort of a segue into this next session with another polling question.
Yeah, give me 1 second. Okay, so for those of you using Poll Everywhere, please call it up. So this is another open-ended question. So what are some ways, and probably keep your answers short, to make an OUS Symposia more accessible and appealing to diverse global audiences? And maybe as we're getting this in, maybe Chris, I'll ask you a question. Have you guys ever done a foreign symposia in a language other than English or with translations available?
I think no. The answer is no. Programs that take place in the international realm. I don't know how this was decided, but English sort of has become the international language of medicine, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong. It's just sort of how it is. So I think that physicians in particular have a working fluency in the English language in their realm of practice to understand, maybe not ideally, optimally, as though it was their first language, but to have a working ability to grasp what's being discussed. And I do think that's an area that we'll touch on in the next section, though, to see how that could be improved upon.
Okay. And I think we're seeing a few answers here about whether it's subtitles, materials in multiple languages, having faculty that represent a diverse geographic need. So I think that's kind of consistency about, what we're seeing, whether it's local gaps, international guidelines, and talking about some differences between practices from country to country. Okay,
Can I just add that I think, Mark, you had said this when we were planning for this, it's really important that the mindset isn't that we use a US provider who's going to take a US, right, symposium and like lift it and bring it to Spain. Like, that's not what we want. We want to have local faculty, diverse faculty, try to regionalize it. So, often congresses are held in different countries and they have a broad audience, but I think it's really important to not be so US centric, right? For this truly to be a global program, and then for the reach to be in that enduring piece to be translated in the international guidelines. Because I think I work in oncology, so it's like NCCN is like the only, but no, there are other, ESMO has guidelines, there are other guidelines. And I think that is on the provider to some extent, right? And on us as a supporter to look for that in a request for this type of education.
Yeah, and I think that's thank you, Kay, for bringing that up. I think that it's so important that they realize that they're submitting for for example, for a European convention, right? If you're going to if you're going to submit for European Congress, well, first there's why are you having all your faculty nominations from San Francisco? Like, how does that really jive with the learners of Europe? And so thinking about that, thinking about subtitles, really thinking about how you're going to engage the outreach. And I think that someone said region-specific outreach. Well, are you tagging along to those societies that are valuable in those regions? And you're like, okay, well, I'm going to reach the ex-US European audience by, connecting the American Heart Association. Well, does that logically make sense, And so I think those are very important points to consider while submitting a proposal from a provider side.
Yeah, I was really impressed with all the open-ended questions and comments that were just submitted in the last poll. I think they were all kind of right on our agenda, essentially. So they're all the things that we all struggle with, being too US centric. And, does ACCME accreditation make it feel like an American program? And, I think that's one of the things as a provider. And so, that's one of the first decisions we need to make if we're going to submit for a potential grant is what type of accreditation are we envisioning for this activity? And so, I think there's some of the considerations from the provider side that come into that are, who is the audience? So let's say there's a program that's going to take place in Spain. Okay, maybe ACCME accreditation is not that important for, clinicians from Spain or even from Europe who are attending that meeting. However, I think, one of the things we're encountering now in the pandemic and post-pandemic era is that program used to be a program with four walls around it and a bunch of people sitting in a room in Spain. That's not the reality anymore. that event became a virtual meeting during the pandemic. And now that we're coming out of the pandemic, we're now in a new world of hybrid meetings. So there's no more going back to the four walls of that room. That is the past. I mean, you could still do that, but you're really going to limit who you can reach. And I don't think that's the mission of any education that we are doing, whether it's company-led or independent. We want it to have the greatest impact that it can. So for us, ACCME, has been a leader in working also with the American Board of Medical Specialties in developing ways that our system that was pioneered around the standards for integrity and independence, and having a framework that everybody understands and has very clear guidance around how to ensure independence when there is commercial support for education, that can have applicability outside of the United States through agreements that were kind of initially sort of reciprocity or mutual recognition, and are now kind of evolving more towards substantial equivalency, saying, everyone doesn't have to have the same system that we do, but can we all kind of have roughly the same idea around what it should be? And so I think that has been something that has really guided us, that ACCME has been a great baseline of accreditation to use. But if we're going into Europe for a meeting essentially as well, would it be beneficial to also have a European accreditation attached to it? And our view on that has always been yes. I mean, we don't want it to be perceived as this is some American program that we've exported. So some of it is optics and some of it is practicality. People who actually want the credit, or someone who wants to see that this activity has been evaluated by a European accrediting body and approved as being an independent educational activity. So some of it's optics, some of it's practicality. So anyway, that's sort of how we come at it from that standpoint. But Mark had sort of raised this question around reviewing grants and around what you're looking for in a needs assessment. And I think some of the points you raised are good ones for providers to be thinking about. If all they're doing is referencing U.S. approved indications for therapies and not recognizing those indications may be different in other parts of the world, or recognizing that guidelines may have some commonalities and also some differences in other parts of the world. And what are those things? I wanted to, kind of come back to something that Maria was mentioning. And I think that being able to round out a grant request with a needs assessment that recognizes diversity in needs, recognizes diversity in how people practice, recognizes diversity in faculty selection. Now the next part is reach and ability to actually execute an initiative and reach clinicians in Brazil or Spain or Germany. So when you look at a grant request, what are you looking for as far as demonstration of that ability? Is that important to you and the other members on the grant committee? Sorry, Maria, I was going to ask.
Yeah, okay, good. No, I was waiting for someone else. So it really depends, Chris, on who we're working with internally and what medical director in that particular country is interested in supporting. With regards to the reach, we're always looking to see how a particular provider can get to where we need them to get to. And that's one of the questions we ask in our capabilities questionnaire. How often do you do ex-US education? When was the last time you did it? How many learners did you educate? And so we're looking for people that have that experience, because a global education, at least for BMS, is so highly visible to the organization, because we don't do as many as you do, Jackie. We really have to make sure that all our ducks are in a row. So the needs assessment has to include gap analysis, learning objectives, all the great stuff that goes into a good grant, but it really has to be robust enough with the reach and with the qualitative and quantitative information in that's incorporated in the needs assessment.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. I know that you guys have probably, a whole list of other things to talk about, and we did get some other questions in. So I do want to ask this one question real quick. Jackie, can you tell us again what you have ex-US providers sign in addition to the LOA?
Oh, so there's the extra process. So after a grant is approved outside the US, we have to then send a survey to them to ask, who owns your company, who's on your board, who's going to be involved in the program. And then we have to do internal due diligence on all those people who are going to be involved, who may potentially benefit from the grant. So there's a couple of sort of steps back and forth. So again, we call it our FCPA process, our FCPA survey. And we have to complete that before we can then sign the letter of agreement for the grant. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And there's
I
sorry,
just wanted to, there's been so much great discussion, and I just wanted to sort of, as a call out for this group, I do think there's going to be a lot of increased interest in doing IME run by our global programs, and especially post-COVID. I mean, I think the impact that COVID has had on both IME, but also on company-led activities, whereas in the past, our colleagues could easily run company-led activities alongside congresses live. If it was in Spain, they followed the local Spanish rules around scientific exchange. And it's all bets are off now. All the programs are virtual. They have a global audience. And I think what I'm seeing is everyone's really realizing this would be so much more appropriate and easy to do actually with a grant in the independent grant space than trying to do company-led global online education and then try and be compliant, with each country's rules. So anyway, just sort of, I think the conversation is definitely on the right track here, and glad we're having it.
All right. Well, great. Well, thank you, Jackie. So for those folks who are watching this either live or enduring, there is a short survey on the live tab of the CME Palooza website that we do use both to get a sense of who's watching and to help us plan for the future. For those folks who are watching this live, there is no need to refresh your browser to view the next session. Just look on our live page and click on the appropriate link. This is our lunch session, I guess, for those on the East Coast. For those in other time zones, you can have whatever meal is appropriate. And that session will start at the top of the hour. So with that, I'd like to thank Chris and Jackie and Maria and Mark and Katie for joining us today. And we will see you all soon.
Thank
Bye,
you so
everyone.
much, Scott, and thank you to you and Derek for just keeping this great program going.
Yep, agreed.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.